Hey guys, and welcome to the Infinimist PvP build guide. This build is basically an adapted form of the PvE Infinimist build, but we're going to be using it to mail other players instead. And I'll show you guys how to build the skill tree, gear, and of course the paragons so that you can beat even the sweatiest gamers. And if you're also tired of losing to tryhard rogues, I'll also go over at the end of the video how to play the build by breaking down some PvP clips. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's go over the skill tree first. So for the basic skill, we're gonna take Reap. We need every corpse we can get, so Reap's important for that. And it also gives us damage reduction for 2 seconds every time we hit an enemy with it. For the core skills, we're grabbing Blight, but we're not taking it for the damage. We're taking it so that we can grab Enhanced Blight and Supernatural Blight. Since we won't be adding it to our skill bar, but instead we'll be spawning it through one of our legendary aspects. And of course here we need 3 points in Hued Flesh. Next in the skill tree is Blood Mist. I know this build is called the Infinimist build, and while if you take it to PvE, you will reset your Blood Mist cooldown faster than you can use it. In PvP, that's going to be much harder to achieve just because there's less targets for you to reduce your cooldown on. Either way, we're going to be going up to Ghastly Blood Mist because the more corpses the better. And for the true star of the show, here is Corpse Explosion. Not only are we putting 5 points into Corpse Explosion, but we're going to be going up to Blighted Corpse Explosion in order to turn it into a Darkness skill. And I just want to remind everyone that Darkness damage modifiers does in fact increase Blighted Corpse Explosion. While it won't show on the tooltip, I have tested it and it does work, and I believe others have tested it as well. Moving on, next is Bone Prison. Now this might look weird at first, but we're taking it for a very specific reason. It tends to spawn a lot of corpses if you take the Ghastly Bone Prison. This seems to be some kind of bug, but we're going to be using it similar to how the Mendeln build uses Bone Prison. I just want to note another weird interaction with Bone Prison. For some reason, the game counts Bone Prison as minions, so your damage reduction is actually lowered every time you use it due to standalone. I just thought this was funny and worth pointing out. Now, if you prefer not to use it, you can take Iron Maiden instead and use the Damned aspect. I was playing around with this and it does do a lot of damage. I think this is actually preferable for PvE, but for PvP, Bone Prison is really good for disrupting your opponents, adding the vulnerable, and of course spawning corpses right on their location. I don't have any Thorns on my gear, so we're taking 1 point in Spiked Armor. Thorns has the ability to proc lucky hits, and we have a lot of lucky hit stuns, so this is great when our opponents attack us, we have a chance to stun them back. We're going to take 1 point in Grim Harvest just so that we can get 3 points into Fueled by Death. It gives us a lot of extra damage after consuming a corpse, and we're going to be constantly consuming corpses through Corpse Explosion. Next on the skill tree is Decrepify. We're going to be grabbing Enhanced Decrepify, which gives us a bunch of stuns, and Abhorrent Decrepify, which lets us reduce our cooldowns. We're not actually putting Decrepify on our skill bar, but this is going to be activated through our Decrepify aura from our Malignant Heart. And of course, Amplify damage is great just for that bonus damage on cursed enemies. Next is Corpse Tendrils, and of course Plague Corpse Tendrils for that higher vulnerable uptime. And we're taking pretty much this whole Darkness tree except for Reaper's Pursuit. I only have 1 point in there. I'd love to have 3 points in there, but I just don't have the points to spare. We're taking Bone Storm for our ultimate and Prime Bone Storm. We don't actually need Supreme Bone Storm since we don't really utilize crit in this build, so don't worry about taking that. We are sacrificing all our minions, so Stand Alone and Memento Mori are great for this build. And for the passive, we are taking Shadow Blight. Now I know Shadow Blight can actually crit, along with a few other things in the build, but it's only going to be a small portion of our damage, so we don't really want to focus on crit. That's it for the skill tree. Let's move on to the gear. I'm going to go over the aspects and some of the stats you want to prioritize per piece. And just a reminder, there seems to be some sort of a soft cap in PvP for armor at around 7200, so just keep that in mind. So on my helmet, I'm going to be running Shielding Storm to help keep you alive throughout the majority of your fights. The stat you want to prioritize on your helmet is cooldown reduction to help keep our Blood Mist and Bone Storm cooldowns as low as possible. And Max Life is also a great stat to try to grab on your helmet. And next on our chest piece is the Explosive Mist aspect. We're mainly taking it just because it reduces the cooldown of our Blood Mist. And for the stats, you'll want to grab as many defensive stats as you can, especially max life and any damage reduction plus damage reduction versus close. For the gloves, I am using Howl from Below. All the stats are really useful here, including lucky hit, chance to stun, and even the corpse skill attack speed is quite useful. The unique effect is also great as it does increase our damage, and it also spawns a skeleton to charge at your opponents instead, which isn't always that useful, but it's hilarious to look at. Next Next on the pants, we are running the Might aspect. It's just great for giving us a big chunk of our damage reduction. For the stats, you want to get plus ranks to Blood Mist and Corpse Explosion. Those are the most important stats to focus on. You want to lower your Blood Mist cooldown as much as possible and increase the damage of Corpse Explosion as much as possible. I have an additional 3 ranks to Bone Prism, which is really nice for the cooldown on that as well. And damage reduction from close is good too, but mine's kind of a low roll. Next on your boots, I'm running the Eluding aspect. This is just great for getting you out of CC when your Blood Mist is on cooldown. The Bubble aspect is also good, but the cooldown is just too long for my taste. The Ghostwalkers aspect is also a great alternative here, which lets you run from pack to pack much faster. At the end, I'll also discuss a different aspect placement so that we can fit Ghostwalkers in here. The main stat you want to focus on is the movement speed. Intelligence is great for increasing your damage as well, and I like running the max evade charges. For the weapon, I am using a wand. The lucky hit on it is great. My stats right now on it are pretty bad. You'll probably want vulnerable, intelligence, all stat, and damage over time or something like that. And I do have the Osseous aspect in order to increase my Bone Storm uptime. Now I know Black River might seem like an obvious option, but for PvP it's actually a little bit tricky to use. When there are enough packs of monsters nearby, Black River is great. However, even when turning in seeds, those monsters felt a bit lacking when I tried it out. Many times I felt like I did less damage than with my wand, and even when I was matching my wand's damage or doing even more, there is another problem with Black River. Each Corpse Explosion is stronger, but you are using less instances of Corpse Explosion. This means you're stacking your Shadow Blight passive slower, and you also have less ticks of Corpse Explosion, which means all your lucky hit abilities are also slower to proc as well. That translates to less cooldown reduction and less stuns, which is not my preferred. If you want to run Black River, you can, and your damage ceiling will be higher, but it's just going to be a lot trickier to use. Next, I am using the Plunging Darkness aspect on my focus. The aspect I'm running also allows me to make use of my Blight, and Blight has a really high lucky hit chance, which just means more corpses. I want to run a focus because it has inherent cooldown reduction, and because it's just more damage than a shield. However, you can run a shield here, and I'll go over that later. On the amulet, I am running the Blighted aspect. With all your shadow damage dots ticking, you actually stack this quite fast, and the damage multiplier is huge, which is why we're putting it on our amulet. For the stats, you'll want ranks to corpse skills. This increases your corpse explosion damage, along with cooldown reduction and movement speed. On the rings, we're using the Ultimate Shadow aspect and the Blood Soaked aspect. The Ultimate Shadow provides more shadow damage ticks and damage. Same thing with Blood Soaked, but it also no longer reduces our movement speed while in Blood Mist, helping us reposition. On the stats, I like to take Max Life, Vulnerable, and Lucky Hit. And I forgot to mention, Lucky Hit is great anywhere you can grab it. We want it so that we can spawn as many corpses as possible from Hewed Flesh. For the gems, I have decided to go with Topazes on my armor, and of course we're taking the Amethyst for damage over time on our weapons. For the hearts, I am taking the Decrepit Aura Heart, just so we can free up a skill slot, and the Sacrilegious Heart to help us activate corpse skills automatically. For the Wrathful Heart, I am using the Caged Heart of Creeping Death. I know in the tooltip it says for monsters and staggered bosses only, but it does work in PvP, at least for now. We have so much CC that our opponents pretty much are either going to be crowd controlled or unstoppable. Another alternative is Great Feast, and if Creeping Death does get patched where it no longer applies in PvP, I would take the Great Feast Heart as we're not using our essence at all. Another one people love to mention is the Barber Heart. I don't think the Barber Heart really makes sense in this build, but the main reason why I don't like including Barber in any of my builds right now is if you guys didn't know, there is actually a glitch right now in PvP where the Barber Heart, if you activate the explosion on a monster, the erupting damage actually doesn't go through the PvP damage reduction modifier, and you basically just one-shot whoever's near the eruption, which is super annoying in PvP right now, and I don't know why Blizzard hasn't fixed this. And I personally have more dignity than to use it myself. But if you guys do use it, just know that I will find you.
And I will kill you.
So anyways, finishing up the gear, I want to go over some alternative options you guys can try. While this is the aspect spread that I decided to go along with, I did try one thing that felt really good to play, but it does sacrifice a lot of damage. In some of the clips I am using this build, and what I did was I moved the Blighted aspect onto my weapon, and then on the amulet I actually put the Eluding aspect, which meant I was able to get that unstoppable quite often. And then on the boots I would run the Ghostwalkers aspect. And then from there on our focus, you can decide between the Plunging Darkness aspect or the Osseous Gale aspect. Keep in mind you don't actually need the Blight pool under Bone Prison to spawn the corpses. Bone Prison will just spawn it itself itself without any damage. And another alternative is to run a shield. That way you can keep your blighted aspect on your amulet and instead run a looting aspect on your shield. From there on again, you can decide between the plunging darkness aspect or the Osseous skill aspect on your weapon. Keep in mind the shield route will mean you'll have less cooldown reduction and less damage. But personally, the reason why I'm prioritizing damage as much as I am is because Corpse Explosion kind of relies on your opponent to stand on top of it. So I'm trying to pump in as much damage as possible to catch my opponents off guard. This way I'll have an easier time sending them to the Shadow Realm. Now that we're done with the gear, let's quickly go over the Book of the Dead. The stats we're taking are pretty obvious. For Skeletal Warriors, you want to sacrifice Reapers for increased shadow damage. Then for Skeletal Mages, you want to sacrifice the Cold Mages for vulnerable damage. And finally for the Golem, we are sacrificing the Blood Golem for maximum life. And now we can finally move on to the Paragon board. Most builds are going to be grabbing all the crit damage nodes, but since this is a damage over time build, we can actually skip all those nodes, making the Paragon board a lot easier. For the first board, we are grabbing the Sacrificial Glyph, just as an easy boost to our base damage and armor. Moving up, we are going to be going into the Wither board first. From here, we're grabbing almost every node because it affects either our shadow damage or shadow damage over time, which does include the legendary node Wither. For the glyph, we are using the Control Glyph. We have a lot of crowd control, and even with all the unstoppables in the game, your opponents will get CC'd at some point, and this is going to help us finish them off. I did try running this board with Territorial instead if you prefer to be more tanky instead of have more damage, so you can switch around your Paragon nodes to do that instead if you'd like. Our third board will be Scent of Death. We are grabbing the legendary node here, and we're also slotting in the Darkness Glyph. Not much to say here besides grabbing a couple armor nodes and health nodes. The next board will be the Flesh Eater board. We are also slotting in the Exploit Glyph here just for more vulnerable damage. And finally for the last board, we are using the Blood Begets Blood board. We don't actually need anything from this board besides the glyph slot. It just happens to be the board with the most willpower in range, which is why we're grabbing it to boost our shadow damage over time. And we will be doing that with the Scourge Glyph. Now that we got the build out of the way, I just want to explain the build a bit more and how to play it. Since the build is originally based on the Infinimus build, the build functions a lot stronger when you do have packs of monsters nearby. This is because the Infinimus build benefits when you have a lot of targets proccing your lucky hits, in which the Decrepify Curse can reduce your cooldowns for all your abilities. On top of that, the additional corpses from the monsters allow you to spam Corpse Explosion a lot more, outputting huge amounts of damage. This also creates a funny interaction when you do fight with the Seething Abomination, which is the big boss that walks around in the Fields of Hatred. He tends to stand still while you fight him, and since he sticks around for quite a while, you can spawn a bunch of corpses and explode those corpses right under his feet, stacking a ton of Corpse Explosion AoEs at once. This creates basically an instant death zone, where they basically take infinite CC and then die, and it's so much stacking dot damage that sometimes it looks like a one-shot from the Barber glitch. But anyways, let's talk about how we want to rotate our skills when we do fight opponents. Generally, how I like to start off a fight is with Blood Mist first. This allows me to set up a couple Corpse Explosions immediately to safely start stacking our Shadow Blight, along with getting our lucky hits for more corpses and cooldown reduction. Immediately after the Blood Mist, I like to pop Bone Storm, just to keep myself safe. Now, ideally you're fighting amongst a bunch of monsters. That way you can start popping Corpse Explosion on all the corpses on the ground, dealing huge damage. Now if that was the case, you would use your Bone Prison as sort of a finisher for when your opponent tries to run, spawning it under them and then continuously popping Corpse Explosion. Now if there weren't any monsters around, you'd probably want to use Bone Prison to spawn the corpses instead for that initial damage. From there, you're going to have to rely on lucky hit chance to spawn more corpses, and if you stacked enough lucky hit, you can actually spawn quite a few corpses just from this. Now the more ideal option is of course to run to another pack of mobs nearby and start the fight from there. Now I want to go over a PvP clip where I break down everything I do against a level 100 Poison Rogue. So first, while I'm running up to the altar, which I know someone is starting, I'm trying to find some mobs nearby that I can pull into the altar zone. You can see I start the fight with a Reap. This is important just to keep your damage deduction modifier up from Reap and the Might aspect. Since the mobs aren't here yet, I'm just going to throw down a Bone Prison real quick just since my cooldowns are pretty low in order to spawn some extra corpses. From there I'm going to go into Blood Mist and into Bone Storm, and as you can see, since the monsters were quite nearby and the shadow damage was ticking, I was able to get my second Blood Mist up quite quickly. We fight for a little bit here, but he does get to turn in his seeds. This is important because the altar stops spawning the mobs. So because of that, I'm gonna have to move since this is a pretty well geared rogue. And once I leave, I also pop his bubble aspect, which is pretty nice. You never want to fight your opponents with the bubble aspect, mainly because they're gonna be immune, and that immunity stops them from getting hit from your bone storm. And that means no shielding storm and no barriers for you. Once he comes in, I do spam corpse explosion under his feet as much as possible, along with a bone prison. Unfortunately, he does barely get out, and instead of chasing him down, I make my way to the right over here where I know there might be more monsters, since I've already cleared the ones on the left. And of course he takes the bait, and this time I do have enough damage to get the kill. I think I did pop Bone Prison a little bit too early here, just cause I was afraid that there weren't enough corpses, but in hindsight I probably should have used it a little bit towards the end. Luckily it didn't matter, and of course I gotta farm a little salt. You hate to see it. I'm going to be leaving a build guide down in the description if you guys want to study it a little bit more in depth. And if you thought this was helpful or liked the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing. Otherwise, that's it for me, and hopefully I'll see you guys in another video.